Well, thank you. Hello and welcome. We are very excited to continue the mobility conversation with a conversation now on pivoting mobility services. This is part of our Techlandia Summit and the mobility track, a week-long virtual conference focused on delivering better community outcomes through improved infrastructure and quality of life, efficient service delivery, sustainable and equitable growth, and long-term resilience. I'm Adrian Pearmine, the National Director for Smart Cities and Connected Vehicles at DKS Associates. I'll be your facilitator of this session, along with Riley O'Brien from the Technology Association of Oregon. You see Riley here on the screen. Everybody see our screen so far with the session facilitators right now?
Yep.
Good. And Riley's going to be helping sort of coordinate the back end support on these slides and things. So a couple rules of engagement, as I mentioned, all participants will be muted. Please remain on mute unless a Technology Association staff member unmutes you and calls on you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to me, to Adrian Pearmine, or to TAO administrator or special events, or however that shows up. Looks like special events. And if you send it to us privately, then we'll see the questions and be able to work that in when appropriate. We will ask all to engage with the participant icon on your screen. So that participant icon down on the bottom shows the whole list of folks. That's, you click on that, and that's where you can do your chatting. So I think we go to the next slide now. Please engage with us on social media during this session. Here's a few different ways. We'll leave that up on the screen just for a quick second so you can jot it down, but got the Twitter address and Facebook and LinkedIn there. We're excited to share what's happening throughout the Techlandia Summit and to get participant takeaways from our events. This session is being recorded. Will be found on the YouTube session within 24 hours of the event. And a huge thank you to our investors that you see here on the screen now on the Techlandia Summit. We appreciate your sponsorship and are excited to explore topics related to economic resiliency, future work, human factors, and this track, mobility, throughout the week. It's my pleasure now to introduce Tim Papandreou. And let's see, so Tim and I first met a few years ago when we were both involved representing our cities and helping our cities pull together responses to the U.S. Department of Transportation's Smart Cities Challenge. I think, what was that now, four or 5 years ago, Tim?
5, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was, I helped Portland, and we were fortunate to become one of the 7 finalists. Tim was working with San Francisco, also one of the 7 finalists in that contest, and both of us went back to Washington, D.C. and helped give our final pitches to US DOT. And neither of our cities were the winner. Columbus, Ohio walked away with the prize in that, but all of our cities that participated in that initiative have really benefited from getting that conversation going around smart cities and smart mobility. And it's one of the reasons here at the Technology Association that we've remained so active and have really become some of the national leaders around the smart mobility discussion. So that's how Tim and I met. Tim, at that point in time, was the Chief Innovation Officer for San Francisco Muni. I think might have been the first Chief Innovation Officer. You can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
I think that was right when cities and agencies were first even considering and discussing that particular role. Tim left San Francisco Muni after working with them for several years and helped Google when they spun off the Google X self-driving car project and started the new company within the Alphabet companies called Waymo. And many of us have been following them ever since in the news. Tim was part of the team that helped stand that up, and now he's back on, I don't know if it's the dark side or the good side or whatever, as a consultant like I am, and helping in this brave new world of mobility. Tim has written a couple articles for Forbes recently, and that was one of the reasons that we were really excited, Tim, to bring you in to today's session, to kind of pick up on the themes that that you're mentioning in those articles about, you know, as crazy as this time is, and as many of us in the transportation space, and across all sectors really, but you know, those of us that focus on mobility really don't know what the crystal ball looks like exactly right now. We don't know, as our cities begin and continue the recovery, what transportation and mobilities look like. We don't know what the impacts are going to be on transit. We certainly can speculate that at least in the short term, it's going to be a big hit there. A lot of us have shifted over to telecommuting as we're doing this event right here. We certainly can see the push and the pull and tugging in multiple different directions. So really look forward to this conversation with you. As I mentioned, I'll be monitoring chats, as will Technology Association. I will probably not interrupt you, Tim, unless there's just a really compelling question that is just on point to a thing you're talking about right then. I may occasionally pop in like that. For the most part, I'll try to save them till the end, and then we can really start a robust conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, and please let me know if there's anything I missed in your introduction that you wanted to share with our audience here, or if we just want to dive into the material.
That's fine. Thank you for having me, Adrian, and Techlandia. Really a Tech Oregon. Really appreciate being part of this discussion. I will. My introduction, my biography is available online, so I'm not going to add any more flavor or color to it. Just that I'll say that one of the reasons why we founded Emerging Transport Advisors was that there was so much misinformation, misunderstanding, and cross-talking between government, the private sector, the technology sector, and academia. And the organization that we founded was really a way to link all those conversations and really bridge the gaps of knowledge, of understanding, and help companies, governments, and startups in the like navigate these pathways that ultimately result in the public right of way. So that's really the crux of what we do. And we work with companies, governments, and agencies all over the world. And it's really fun because you said it was maybe be the dark side. I think it's actually the bright side, because we can actually work with anybody who wants to get a better understanding of this world and space, and then help them navigate things. And we have nothing to sell. So we are very neutral. Even though we have strong opinions on things, we're very neutral in how these move forward. So I guess I'm going to share my screen and do a little bit of a presentation. And then go from there. So let me try. Screen. Can you see my screen?
So far, I'm still just seeing your camera.
Okay.
Did it say that? Yeah, it looks like you're a co-host. So, and when you click on the share screen button down below, what is it telling you?
Oh, I've got to go back to this thing again. Hang on.
We had this on the kickoff on Friday when Paz was presenting. He said, "Isn't it funny that it's always the smart cities people that have the biggest challenges getting the technology to work for us?"
Yeah, it should work now, I think. Can you see that now?
I'm still seeing the camera. I'm not sure, is anybody, anyone else seeing?
You should be able to see this now.
Okay.
Does that work?
Now we see your screen.
Okay.
Second bridge into San Francisco.
Yes. Yeah. View. present. There we go. Okay. So thank you again for having me. This is, those of you who are familiar with San Francisco, this was the evening of the shutdown. The Oakland Bay Bridge is the double-decker bridge, literally had 1 or 2 vehicles over it, and it just showed you how quickly we changed things. And what we know is that we're not going back to the old normal. We're going to have a new way of looking at how we look at our whole society, let alone our transport system. And you know, this was the reality that we had to deal with. I captured this photo in San Francisco where we had 2 worlds. You know, one world where the ad on the bus is talking about this thing called Zoom that most of you had never seen before, and now we live by it on a daily basis. There is an essential service being offered, which is the public transit system with the driver in there. And then there's a essential worker crossing the street, and really that's been the situation we had for the first couple of months, where those who could work from home would work from home, and those that had to work in the public space had to get there, risking a lot of issues and situations, and also being deemed essential workers when most of the people in this space were kind of ignored. They didn't really exist in our discussions of our economy, especially at our conferences on mobility. And it became very clear that we had these 2 different systems, and they were trying to work together. What we do know is that we're going to have a very uneven response to this moving forward. You know, we're going to have differences, and we've seen them already, whether it's by job type, by professional organization, by race, by class, by age, by abilities. Our transport system was completely inequitable before, and many of you on the call have been working for decades to try and make it more equitable. But the fact of the matter is that the COVID-19 situation basically shone the brightest light on all of the vulnerabilities that we have. And so that's been a real challenge for us as we move forward. There's been a lot of speculation out there about what we can do and how we can do it, but very few have a handle on where this is going. We do know that 2 things. One, it'll be very uneven across the world, even within countries, even within regions, and that the worst thing we can do at this point is try and go back to the way it was, because it's just not going to work. We also know that this is a shock. It's a shock to the system, but it's a short-term shock. The long-term trends are unwavering. Mobility is going through fundamental transformation towards more of these 3 mega trends, which is more sharing, more electrification, and more automation, all backed in and supported by digital and data transformation. So these are the long-term trends that will not, that are unwavering, even though we're having these short-term shocks to the system through the tragedy that is COVID-19. It also be very clear, many times we've heard that there's a silver lining or an opportunity, and even I misstated that. I think it's really important to know that this is a tragedy. It's an absolute disaster that we're dealing with. And it's actually more than an opportunity, it's a wake-up call to redo and redefine how we do transportation. The most acute transition that we're seeing that's been underway is a shift from traditional transport to more community integrated transportation. Again, the COVID-19 reality has really questioned the 2 on the left, and more people are at risk of being asked to or pushed into car mobility in a time when it's a real risk to do that. It's an affordability question. It further exacerbates the suburban, urban, rural issues that we have already in our transport system. The integrated mobility option now, I think, is really being fast forwarded. Many companies, I'll talk in a little bit, are really starting to struggle with the idea that they need to actually work together. They need to figure out these things. A lot of things that were difficult to do, a lot of conversations that were difficult to have before are now being had, and our company is in the middle of a lot of them, to let you know that these things have to be reconciled. Otherwise, we're going to go from worse to terrible. So really, this is the time to think about some of the transition opportunities we can do. And so we also know that mobility is interconnected to many issues of society. We can't just talk about transport or mobility on its own. We also can't talk about modality on its own. Mobility, if we talk about what we're really talking about is access. Access is more important than mobility. And in the space of mobility, mobility is more important than modality. And we kind of get stuck sometimes on those things. So what are the things that we care about? We care about front and center about our public health. We've spoken a lot about transport in the past, about making things more accessible, more greener, clean, etc. But the public health aspect, I think, has become really front and center in the last couple of months. In the last couple of weeks, many of the issues that were being ignored or weren't being talked about enough or weren't being addressed adequately are about the social justice issues. I know many of you on the call and many practitioners, we've fought really hard to create these social equity opportunities and lenses, but there are particular things that are persistent and pervasive that have not been addressed. And the simple fact is that the idea that we could provide a public right-of-way that was safe for people to not get hit by cars was one thing, but creating a system that was safe to not protect certain people, especially the Black community, from being injured and killed by our police system, our enforcement system, those things are areas that really need to be dug a lot deeper. We also know that these two pieces, public health and social justice, are literally the first indicators of climate action and climate justice. And I know in Oregon, you've been working really hard on your climate work, as we have in California, but the two pieces of the public health and social justice outcomes really are integral to this. And transportation or mobility threads across all of these issues. And I think that's the wake-up call that we have in this moving forward. And not everybody has the answers. You know, certain groups like government agencies know certain things, companies know certain things, consulting groups and advisors, et cetera, know certain things, academics know certain things, institutions, et cetera, the community at large, but not everybody has their hand on it. What we do know is that this is a shock event. And this shock event is like similarly to a disaster that's occurred to a region. And in disaster recovery, we tend to have key phases that we go through. And if we apply these processes, not the exact way of doing it, but if we apply this thinking and this methodology, we can actually get through this in a way that actually helps a lot of us to move forward. So we have the event trigger. That's when someone like government usually presses the button and shuts things down. We end up having a shut-in economy, and we have to figure out how do we survive in this shut-in economy. Then we have to triage, whether it's a government or a company, they basically triage and figure out what is their core purpose, how do they focus on operations that can meet their basic customer needs, and what is the basic level of support. Some agencies have actually shifted staff away from non-essential tasks to essential tasks. Those are the kinds of things that we see in the triage period. And we went through this in March and most of April and May. Now we're starting to see that companies and governments are starting to pivot. We're starting to see reformatting of business models, reformatting of ideas, reformatting of approaches to see what's worked, what hasn't worked. And this is the opportunity in this time to really start thinking about, can we actually pilot with our space, our place, our community? Can we actually pilot different ways of engagement? How have we engaged in the past? Are these areas that were historically neglected or inadequately served? And will this temporary thing actually serve this? Or will it actually make things worse? It's not a one size fits all for each part of the region. And so having those engagement dialogues right now is absolutely critical in this pivot phase. Ideally, as we're going to go through recovery later this year, looking at reintegrating what was done well, setting aside what wasn't done very well and revising that, looking at processes inside the company or the agency, what worked and what didn't work. This is really that discovery opportunity, working with your customer base, your communities of different communities, and seeing what can we do to figure out how we move forward. This is where we're going to start having a dual world where a lot of people will be working from home still. Some will be coming to the work site. those that have to be at the work site, figuring out ways to work in more transformative ways. And then ideally, learning from all that recovery period, and next year looking at ways that we can transform our governments, our agencies, our companies in ways that create new models of resiliency so that we don't get caught again with the second wave and the third wave flat-footed, that we actually can see this, anticipate it, and be in a way that makes us much more effective as an organization. And so to do that, we need to go back to basics. We need to really look hard at how we look at our transportation business models and what we do with those models in terms of how we look at them. We need to look at ways that we support these business models, how we subsidize these business models, and how we actually, to our unfortunate policies, actually ensure that they don't work. So how are we part of the opportunity? How are we part of the solution? But how are we also part of the problem? So we have this ownership model, which is you own your car. Some people can own their bike, their scooter, or their moped. This is the predominant model that we've had for decades. We've spent way too much money and way too much policy time on subsidizing the private car ownership at the detriment of even owning your own bike or scooter or moped, just by the fact of how we look at our roads, our right-of-way, our parking, and our allocation of resources, even our rules and our laws. You know, a lot of it is skewed towards this model. We have the ride model, which is the public transport and the ride hailing and on-demand services model. This is a model where you ride a service, whether you go to it or it comes to you. And that's really struggled because of the over-subsidization of the ownership model. Public transit is subsidized to the tune of sometimes 70, 80, 90%, because it can't compete in this world where there's lots of free roads, lots of free parking, and low density systems. So we have to figure out a way to really understand what is the purpose of public transport. In the last 3 months, it's basically shown us that it's not just essential, it's actually critical to keeping our society functioning. So many of our essential workers were relying on using public transport or getting around in ways that use these on-demand services. So we really need to think about what is the role of an agency or on governance on this service, and how do we actually support it in ways that are different than just focusing on ridership and focusing on fare box recovery. We need to think of this as an actual essential service that needs minimum support, something like infrastructure, where you don't question its value, you basically ensure that it's actually put in that space. And then the third model, which is the rent model, this is the model where you rent things, whether it's a car or a scooter or a bike or any other device or a truck. And these services have struggled the most because of, again, the ownership model has been so subsidized that it's very difficult for these services to work. And in fact, in some situations, government have actually made it punitive for these services to work, even though they show promising climate action benefits, public health benefits, and social justice benefits. We treat them as a pariah. And we really need to be very careful that we don't try and throw the baby out with the bathwater in that sense, where just because we've seen some issues before with the ride model or the ownership model, that we don't focus on the rent model and figure out ways to help them, because they provide access in ways that the ownership model and the ride model don't. And all three models are very symbiotic and very supportive of each other. But we need to have some hard decisions about what is the right price to have a person pick someone up and drop them off. What is the right price to have a service use the right of way? And what is the right approach to charge for the use of the right of way at the right time? All these questions are really, now's the time to really think about how do we discuss these questions about governance and what's the right approach. And so we're experiencing a new mobility normal where we're seeing companies, governments, a lot more open to trying different things. As Adrian mentioned in the very beginning, no one has the crystal ball, but we do need to try different things and see how they go. We also have a reality where we're going to have a lot of transit capacity restrictions for the time being until we can get a little bit better handle on how to minimize the spread of COVID. We've seen some articles come out recently where Transit is not seen as a super spreader as it may have been thought of before. So that should be something that we work very clearly on, messaging on how to improve capacity while working on ways to get people from A to B that doesn't result in driving their car. We've seen a lot of push by cities around the world on healthy streets, and healthy streets are critical to get the ability to move, to walk, bicycle, other modes in these corridors, so that we can socially distance and safe distance people in their movement. I think the question with healthy streets is healthy for whom? And we have to be very careful as we're looking at this to engage in the communities. It's not the community as one. There's many communities, and what may work in one community may not be what another community wants. So engagement is really important right now as we look at piloting, as we look at these healthy streets, and as we look at these different situations, so that we can make sure that we're truly serving the community and the public that we care about. So this is really difficult to do. It's easy for me to say it, and many of the companies and governments that I'm working with is trying to figure out, how do we shift mindset? How do we have more empathy about the situation that we're in? It's really hard to be a government employee right now. It's really stressful. It's really stressful to be a company employee right now. There's a lot of things that you're struggling with. We're seeing unemployment. We're seeing a lot of issues on the street that are really reminding us that we haven't done a really good job of mobility in the past. So all these questions really need to start thinking about, how do we shift our mindset by empathizing more, saying yes and rather than the problem is, and then prototyping. What works? What can we try? How do we do small tests in these areas? And how do we try different approaches that we've known that could be different? And this is the time to try them out and work really close with the community and ask them the questions. How do they want to see things different? What can we do, if anything? Is mobility even part of this discussion, or is it something else? Those are the opportunities where you can really talk with and around all the different issues that are bubbling up right now. And I think the most important thing is to figure out, as we go back to basics, is look at our right-of-way. This is the one thing that we have management over. We manage our right-of-way. And having the footprint priority really is the conversation that needs to start from the basics. A typical person can move around in about 1 square yard of space. A person on a bicycle needs about 2 of those squares. They can get into that space, especially when they're moving on their bicycle. Same thing with a person on a scooter. But a person in a private passenger vehicle needs 8 of those spaces just to open the door and get inside the vehicle. And they need between 8 and 16 of those spaces just to move the vehicle. So from day one, we have a disparity in how we prioritize our right-of-way. All of our policies are prioritizing the person in the 8x space over the person in the 1x and 2x space. And as we need to safe distance and relook at our transportation system, we can't do that anymore. We have to stop doing that. And it's difficult, it's tenuous, it's charged, but this is the point of the engagement. We need to figure this out. And in some communities, it may be that being in their car is the safest option because of how they look and their situation they're in, and that's okay. We have plenty of people who can shift modes. We don't have to focus on everybody shifting it. We just need a few people to shift, and we can do that fairly easily. And so what does that look like? Well, last year, it looked like this. People crammed on narrow sidewalks. If there's a bike lane, if you're lucky, you're squeezed between transportation and parked vehicles. If you're smart, you have a protected bike lane, but it's very fragmented, and the right-of-way is dominated by people driving their car, and those on a bus are stuck in traffic like everybody else, and it really is a waste of space. This is clearly an example of how the old normal wasn't working, and it just made it difficult for everybody. Nobody could benefit from this. The new normal is really a difference in how we look at our right-of-way based on public health, social justice, and climate action. And that's a very different approach in how we look at things. We no longer have the dividing line between the sidewalk and the vehicle right-of-way. It's now between people walking and cycling, and those taking modified transit, and the space left over can be for private passenger vehicles on certain corridors. This is not for every single corridor. This is for key corridors that we need to be able to make sure that people can move around. And even when we have transit capacity caps of between 10 and 12 passengers per bus, we're actually still moving more people per hour per lane than when they were in their own private vehicles. So this is a win-win-win on so many levels. And it's just great to see that happening in so many cities, but there's still many more cities where this is not happening. And we really need to change this conversation on who do we prioritize, who is this for, and how does this help? So we're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing it in so many places. We're seeing it in Europe, in the US, in North America, in South America. We're seeing it in Africa. We're seeing it in Australia and the Pacific. We're seeing it in Asia. Everywhere is looking at how do we reprioritize our space on the street so that we can effectively move people safely, but we can also make it a way that transforms how we prioritize our space moving forward. And we're seeing a lot of examples of this, as you can see. And we're also going to be seeing a new work normal. One of the reasons we had traffic congestion in the first place was because of our work culture. We all had to go to work in the morning, we had to go home from work in the evening, and that created peak congestion on the highways. It created peak congestions on our streets. It also created peak congestion on crowding on our transit system. We're not sure that's going to come back. Yes, it's going to come back in a certain amount, but we're not clear yet if it's going to be at the levels that we had before, or that it could get worse than we had before, or it could not come back to those levels. What we do know is that we're going to be working in a different way. Some people will be working on site, most will be working off site. Sometimes some people come in, sometimes some people don't come in. The cost of retrofitting real estate to accommodate everybody working at a safe distance is cost prohibitive. Many companies that we're working with right now have already hired people in the last 3 months where they don't have the desk space anyway. So there's going to be a lot of changes in our work culture where we're going to have a lot more interactions and collaborations, both online and offline, on-site and off-site. And so that's going to be a wake-up call for how we use our real estate. And it's going to also affect how we use our downtowns. And these downtowns are going to shift from being just these focuses of flushing office workers in and out to being much more neighborhood in their approach. We're also going to have a new shared mobility normal. For all the new shared mobility services, there's going to be rider protocols. And those rider protocols are going to be requiring us to do things that we may not be comfortable doing, whether it's wearing masks, temperature checks, contact tracing. All those things are going to be part of the new shared mobility normal. And we're going to have to build trust. We're going to have a lot more trusted networks where there's going to be certification and verification that this is actually a trustworthy device to use. This is a trustworthy service to actually ride in. Because if we don't build trust based on our personal levels of risk, we're going to see people who are going to be shy from using these services. So developing trust is going to be critical as we move forward. And then this is the opportunity for more integration of technology. So touchless systems or contact-free, touch-free services are going to be really important, because how we use our journey, everything along our journey that requires us to touch something, to put something in and to pick something up, is going to be a real challenge and a barrier moving forward for the general population to use these. So we're going to have to think about ways to digitize a lot more things that were either on the back burner, or were an idea, or we knew we need to do, or it was a strategic action in the near future. We need to do that now, and we need to start working on these right now. So, and we're also going to have a new commerce normal. We're having already in-store protocols on safe distancing and all those different things, but delivery and pickup became the norm during the shutdown. And if we have a second and third wave of shutdowns, we're going to see a lot more delivery. That pickup was a real question, and it really woke up cities on their right-of-way. How little they knew about their pickup and delivery systems, how little transparency they had on what their loading zones were needed for. So all of these questions now are being raised about what is the loading zone supposed to be for? How do we digitize it? How do we get a better understanding of who's using it? How often is it being used? What is the utilization of that space? And then looking around, realizing that, wow, all of these parking spots for private cars is not the best use of space. We actually need more delivery space, more pickup space, and now we need more space for outdoor dining and outdoor eating, because our restaurants cannot handle a capacity restriction with the in-store protocols to make themselves work. So if we really care about small businesses and all of our amazing neighborhood commercial areas, we need to really look at how we use our space outside. And some cities are getting it right, and some cities are not looking at this clearly enough, because we still need to keep our streets and our sidewalks accessible. Accessibility is number one. If we cannot have a clear path for a person in a wheelchair or an assisted device, we're actually making things worse. So yes, we do need outdoor seating, and it's wonderful to take the parking spot and some of the sidewalk space, but we need to make sure that we keep it accessible as we move forward. Now, in this space of transformation, we're going to be needing a lot more resilience, which means that a lot of these mobility companies, unfortunately, are not going to make it through this process. They're starting to consolidate. A lot of government department programs are also being paused or suspended because of lack of resources coming in. So we're going to need to think smarter about how do we work with these situations that we have coming towards us. And we need to look at more of what we're calling restorative partnerships, not just public-private partnerships because they're interesting to do, but they need to either restore the inequities, restore the social issues that we had, or restore the transportation situations that we had, but get them to the point where they're restorative and they actually help as we move forward. And then this is really the opportunity for digital integration. So a lot of things that were on the back burner for 2 years away, a lot of companies that we're working with right now are doing digital integration as we speak. Some are saying that they're doing 2 years worth of digital upgrades in 2 months because they have to. They have to move with the times and get themselves organized. So there's opportunities to look at, especially for governing agencies, how can we do more work remotely? What does that look like? Getting access to our files and our services, doing more remote partnerships where an essential worker is actually at a facility, an engineer is at home, and they're working together via video to figure out how they can look at asset management. All these partnerships right now are being discussed. And whether it's with a shared mobility company or an enterprise company, all of these partnerships really need to be core and centered to how do we do things better? How do we serve our public? And what does it actually look like? And then we need to understand as we move forward on the governance of this. Too often we tend to govern by policy that is not clearly understood in its impacts across all of the spaces that we're working in. So having clear guardrails up front of, and this is where a lot of the work that we're doing right now is internal alignment and internal change management work, because we need to get our houses in order to be able to safely and effectively have good governance to the public right of way. So safety has always been a push from a traffic perspective, but now safety has to look at safety by race and class and public safety so that you don't get hurt by just physically being outside, by jogging, by walking, by cycling. That goes into re-looking at equity from perspective of restoration and restoring equity in spaces. Interconnectivity means that how do we make sure that all these new services that come in actually interconnect so that we can actually have the mobility as a service that we talk about, that we care about, so that our riders, our customers, our communities can actually benefit from the different services that work for them. And how to ensure that it's affordable. We can't just have really over-subsidized public transport or private driving and then expect people to pay, oops, something just happened here. Can you guys see that?
I can still see your guardrail slide, Tim.
Oh, you can? Okay, good. All right, so then we can just let that go. We need to see how critical it is for how we look at this from a perspective of how we subsidize things. We need to look at the ways that we can't expect people to pay the prices they're paying for scooters or for bikes or for ride hailing compared to the other modes if we want people to shift. I think that's really where the key is right now in understanding that we work with all of these organizations to figure out what is the cross-subsidy that we could do. Can we ensure that we can cross-subsidize scooters or bikes, whatever it is, to ensure that they go into all the areas so that they're affordable for everybody? Those are some of the big questions that we need to ask while keeping understanding of sustainability so that it's not just environmentally sustainable, but these things actually can be around, because unfortunately, we've seen them come and go, and these partnerships are really important as we move forward. So we have an opportunity to, did this go to the next slide?
No, it did not advance past the guardrails one. So that's
okay. Let me see what's going on. Okay. How about now? Okay, it's gone now.
Yep.
We have an opportunity on a level now to really work together. We can know that governance really comes from government, but the information can come from the community, from the companies, from the research institutions, and that's really the time now to really reach out. It may be the only time in your career that you really get to really try these things out in ways that haven't been done before. And I think that we don't have the usual blockers that we've had in the past. So there's a really good opportunity to really try these things out and see how we go. And there are many unknowns. We know that we have a lot of work to do, but we can do some upfront strategy work and really get our handle around this so that what we can do is become more resilient by knowing that here are the triggers that we have, here are the areas that we're vulnerable with. And as we move forward, we can actually, as we receive these inputs, we know how to respond proactively. And that's really the work that we're doing right now. So it's really an important time to have these deep discussions, to really think about this from a perspective of how we can actually engage our communities, how we can work better together, because the time, unfortunately, is going to be short, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes of last year, or worse, make them worse than they were moving forward. So I really want to press that on you all to really think about this, figure out ways that you can engage. Happy here to help as we can, and figure out ways that we can work together. I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me.
Great, Tim. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I recognize many of these topics you were talking about even pre-COVID, especially around the cities being a bit more innovative in their approaches, using the more agile pilot process and those kinds of things. And so our keynote speaker for the entire conference back on Friday talked about a couple different things. And one of them was this COVID kind of being the great accelerator, taking trends that we were already seeing. And you can use the example of big car rental companies going out of business. They were probably going to go out of business in the next year or two anyway. And we saw some of those trends. And so it kind of hit the gas on a few of those. He also talked about it being the big defroster in a certain way. And helping things that have been frozen for so long. And I took a lot of that as especially our governments, who can be really slow to react on some of these things, have actually been really quick to react on this. And so I think that you hit a lot of key points. One thing I'd like to do, because I often forget to do this, those of us that spend all of our time in the mobility and transportation space forget that not everybody is on the same level, and with some of the topics like healthy streets. Here our PBOT calls, we've got slow streets are a little bit different than healthy streets. There's different cities call them different things. So could you talk a little bit about what you meant in the healthy streets concept and what we call slow streets, and then on the alfresco dining piece?
Yeah, so healthy streets is basically the name that we're giving to all of those interventions that basically are repurposing the public right-of-way for more walking and cycling, and basically open access and open walking. So whether it's a slow street, safe streets, open streets, doesn't matter what the first part of it is, it's about reprioritizing the right-of-way so that more people can safely walk and bike and all those different things. Many cities, and some big cities like London and Paris, are using parallel corridors to allow people to basically walk or to cycle instead of taking public transport. So they're basically mimicking the transit corridors and using that opportunity to do that. Some cities are basically allowing only local access for vehicles. Some are closing access to vehicles. So it just depends on the variety. It's less, the key piece of it to me are less important. It's the purpose behind it that's much more important. It's that the government is saying, we hear you, public. We know you need to safely distance and walk and exercise, etc. And you need to commute effectively. We're going to prioritize the space for you to do that, and we're going to do it in a very we're going to do it in a way that's going to be quick. The challenge we have is that if you don't ask every community, do they actually want this? You run the risk of foisting something on a community that didn't actually want this, and then it's basically a band-aid to a situation that runs much deeper. So this shouldn't be instead of your long-range planning, your infrastructure planning, all those community engagement processes that you should be doing anyway. This is basically a tool to use in the areas that make the most sense at the time. And on the alfresco dining, what that means is that many cities now are creating an as-of-right permit to allow small businesses, either they're serving food, predominantly serving food, but some that are serving alcohol, etc., to basically open up outside their store and use the parking spot across the sidewalk, or use extra sidewalk space to allow people to sit down and eat in a safe distance. Because what that means is that at the current cap that a lot of the public health departments have put for small businesses, they can't actually make it work financially to open if they can only have 20% seating capacity. So cities have allowed them now to open up and use the external space. Sometimes the store has two retail stores next to it that don't need the adjacent space. So they'll put the tables next to their spaces. So they can open up from just 20% capacity to like 50 or 75% capacity. Many cities have actually closed some commercial streets with barricades on end to end of the block. And the entire street now is an outdoor alfresco dining area. And it's not tied to a specific restaurant. All restaurants can basically use that space. It's kind of like basically an outdoor food court. So those are the kind of opportunities that are being experimented with small business commissions and local economic development groups, because if you don't do those things, chances are your small businesses, mom and pop restaurants may not make it. And they're doing it right now where the weather is good, while giving themselves a 3 or 4 month window to figure out how do they do it when it gets colder in the colder months. So I hope that explains the purpose behind that.
Yeah, no, that was really helpful. I mean, we, certainly have seen a lot of the restaurants saying, well, it's great that we can open back up in phase 1 or phase 2, but if we're cut to 50% of our capacity, we only got 9 tables in our whole place. That
right.
our margins barely made it to begin with. So that's a great example. And you touched on a little bit, you gave a couple different examples, one around accessibility and making sure when you do these things, you do it right, and that people in wheelchairs and other accessible issues and challenges are still addressed. You were also talking about this not being a one-size-fits-all, that you just sort of blanketly apply across the city. I've read some different articles about our continuing ongoing challenge with equity and investing in the right places and thinking that we know best for all neighborhoods. Are there any kind of more specific thoughts on how to do this right? Obviously communicating with the neighborhood, making sure that it's what they want, which is tough to do in an era of COVID. So what are some lessons there?
Well, so there's been some community groups that have been reaching out to the city for a decade, and they have been ignored, frankly, on what their needs are. This is the time to really have those discussions of like, look, what are the things that you need as a city, not just as the transportation agency. The challenge we have sometimes with our silos is that cities basically go out as a department or as an agency, and the community that they're speaking with sees them as the city. And we need to either all go out together or go out as a representative ambassador saying, I'm here to listen to all the needs you have, and then bring them back to our different city groups, rather than sorry, I'm only here for mobility. That's all I can talk about, because that is just very disingenuous engagement. And it really annoys the communities, especially the ones that have been marginalized and historically ignored. And the other situation we have is we should listen to and get advice from advocacy groups that represent a modality, but they aren't the final decision maker on what we should do. That is an input, not the sole source of information. And so as we can see, economic development groups, social justice groups, modality groups, the pro-transit, the pro-bike groups, et cetera, small business groups, all of these groups have a valid voice in receiving the input. And this is the beauty of when we actually have engagement with the community. We'll find that you went there saying, we want to give you a slow street, and you realize what they really wanted was the alfresco dining. That's what they wanted. So you're going to ask them, what is it that is important right now? Is it visibility? Is it foot traffic? Is it traffic congestion? Is it policing? And frankly, a lot of the issues are around policing. And so many times these Vision Zero programs, for example, will say, look, it's a Vision Zero issue, and one of the E's of Vision Zero is enforcement. And that is an absolute no-no in a certain community, because that is exactly the problem. So how do you move away from the E of enforcement to focus on the E of engagement first, to figure out what is actually needed? So to me, it's what's worked with my experience has been actually reaching out. Sometimes now you can do Zoom calls, etc., but sometimes you can just go outside and you can be safe distanced with 3 or 4 of the community organizers and have a conversation, walk together safely in the area and figure out what works, or go on a bike ride together. You can still do that, and that's still happening right now. And to me, I think we're a little Zoom fatigued, and now we can actually do more of the outdoor engagement. The weather's nice now, so this is I think a good time to go out there and actually talk and bring people outside and figure how you can move forward.
We've got some great questions that have been coming in on the chat bar, so I'm going to go to those in just a quick second, and I may even try to experiment with taking the individuals off of mute. So Anne, get ready if you want to try to ask your question. And if not, I'll go ahead and read it off of the chat bar. But I wanted Tim to do one more level set just to make sure that everybody understood some of the things that you were talking about. Again, for those that don't kind of live and breathe in the mobility space every single day, you were talking a lot about the prioritization of our roads and right-of-ways and subsidization and those types of things. So can you elaborate just a little bit more on kind of what you mean by the historic subsidization of the single occupant vehicle? I think most people get it, so we probably don't have to hammer it too long, but maybe more importantly, some of the tools that we can be looking at in the future, for instance, the congestion pricing or curb management and some of the other things. So let's not assume everybody is on the same page with those tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are big statements that I've made, so they're not to be just swallowed all at once. But historically, over the last 7 decades, government has funded personal automobile ownership, and whether it's through freeways that you don't pay for to go on, whether it is streets that we don't pay to use, free parking structures, the whole police system around traffic enforcement and traffic management, traffic court, how we have single family zoning and we subsidize the streets to the new suburbs while under investing in the inner central areas of the city. All these not having a fragmented bike lane network, not having a good transit system because we run out of money because we spend so much money on the highway and road system. All these things compound together and make it very difficult for people to use public transport because it's unreliable, it doesn't have protected right-of-way, it doesn't have money to make it frequent, or to bicycle or to walk, because if you live far apart from places, it's really difficult to walk 3 or 4 miles. You can't do that every day. You also can't bicycle if you have to cross 6 and 8 lane highways to get from A to B. So we've kind of designed the situation where really the only option is to drive. And unfortunately, we have a lot of low-income populations in this country that can't afford to own a car. And so if you can't afford to own a car and you can't use the other modes, you are literally stranded and isolated from opportunities and economic opportunity. So that's the big picture issue that we need to dismantle and unassemble, so that we can actually create more inclusive communities and figure out ways to get around in the most affordable way. When I showed those diagrams of prioritizing our right-of-way, it wasn't for every single corridor and every single street. It was for specific corridors and specific streets that we can eke out more space so that we can make walking and cycling safer and easier and more convenient for those that choose to want to do that. What that means is that enough people would shift from that and then not have to drive all the time. I've done countless surveys in my career where people say, I hate traffic, I hate driving, but I have no other option to get around. I'm either disabled visually or not, or physically. I have limitations, etc. And I'd wish I could, but I can't. And we always respond and say, that is fine. But there are a lot of people who can. And we're trying to figure out how we can allow space so that those who can shift and give you access to a better opportunity as well, so that you can actually ride the transit system that's more reliable, or you can walk or cycle, or you can drive. You know, we don't need everybody to shift. We just need a few people to shift. The classic example is on those public holidays where not everybody's taking the public holidays. Sometimes it's, you know, the anti-Columbus Day, I call it, but those examples where 10% of the population is actually at home, but everybody else has still gone to work. Our traffic system works free flow. We have no crowding on our transit system. So we don't need 90% of the people to shift. We need 10 or 20%. And I think if we can create the conditions on certain corridors, people will do that, because we've already seen it happen now. And that's really the thing. And on your point about what else we can do, well, you know, governments can basically not require all this parking in these developments. That's what makes housing so expensive as we build up in our cities. Requiring parking adds $60,000, $70,000 for the unit. That's the difference between someone who can afford it and someone who can't. We can prioritize our streets. We can look at our curb space and make sure that our public right-of-way is actually used by the public, not by a private car owner. You know, these are all cultural issues that we need to work on, but too many times we've found that we've taken it for granted because that's just the normal that we thought. But this is the time to really reopen and think about, well, why are we using our right-of-way? Who is it for? And how do we ensure that everybody can access it in a way that's actually fair, that's safe, it's environmentally sustainable, and that's enjoyable as well.
Okay, so we'll go over to Anne's question now. Let's see if
I think I answered it.
Well, kind of. I think part of what she was talking about, though, if I read it right, was as we're in this, you know, hopefully temporary period of transit being not nearly as much availability. It's vastly restricted in terms of number of seats available. We have the lofty goals that you were just describing, but we also have current reality. So Anne, I don't know if you want, I see you're off mute now, if you wanted to dig in a little deeper, or if you did feel it was answered.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And Timothy, you did answer it in large part. I just wanted to note that, you know, when we went into the lockdown restriction situation, I'm on the other side of the country. I'm in the Washington, D.C. region.
Yeah.
Public transportation options were an epic fail, and we're still in them. I mean, you know, half the buses are shut off, literally their capacity within the bus to isolate off the driver, which is great, but, you know, half that capacity was gone. The metro, for example, all public transportation in DC and the surrounding regions closes at 9 p.m. I got stuck downtown in Washington Sunday evening because I didn't realize everything, metro, buses, etc., was shutting down. So so if you didn't have a personal automobile to go to the grocery store, if you were far from a grocery, beyond work, etc., you are out of luck. I think this whole COVID thing has been an enormous rethink for people who are trying to say, let's do public transportation. They're basically saying, if I've got a family or I have somebody elderly that I'm trying to care for, I got to have a personal automobile. I think it's sales of automobiles, and especially used automobiles, are way up because people are saying, hey, when push came to shove, public transportation just shut down for 3-4 months. So it's a tough call, but I think it's a nuanced question at this point. It's kind of like talking about single family residential housing sales are way up because people are saying, gee whiz, I don't want to get stuck in a high-rise condo in another COVID situation. So I just throw that in. I don't think it contradicts anything you said,
No.
Timothy, necessarily, but I mean, there is the reality that all these sort of masterminded public transportation systems just failed. They just shut down. I mean, failed is the wrong word, but from a rider's perspective, it was like, what? Standing at a bus stop, nothing was available. In the DC region, they weren't even good about, they made generic notices about the times, but they didn't attempt to adjust, online schedule information, etc. So unless you kind of knew where to go to look at it was just a fail. Right. Nothing was coordinated. It was just like, well, we're going to shut down and good luck to you.
Yeah.
So I think that, I think we're going to have repeats of what we just went through, regrettably, because of this new sensibility about public space hygiene. The personal automobile was the way to go. Yeah, that was your only option.
Yeah, I totally hear that. Unfortunately, the world is very uneven around the world, and the cities that had good public transit systems, and by good I mean reliable for everyday use, around the world kept them going because they realized that's the community value. And unfortunately, in the United States, we had an epic fail. And I think that's you raised it, you put it really well. I didn't want to say it at the beginning, but you said it for us. So, the challenge we've had in the past is that there is a real push now, that's what I said, on trusted networks, to really gain the trust of the customer. And how you develop trust with the customer is through transparency and conversations and communication and engagement. And historically, we have underfunded our transit systems in the US because we're spending too much money on other things, and they don't serve in the way that they should, like they do in Europe or in Asia. And we've seen a big difference. I personally was really disappointed to see so many transit agencies shut down. They were caught in the mix, they were caught in the shock, and for safe reasons that public health agencies demanded, that they didn't actually offer the services because they were scared that they were actually spreading the virus. We know now that wasn't the case, but the fact of the matter is how they communicated that, especially to your example, is really unfortunate because losing trust for the riders that they had is going to be difficult to gain back now. Yes, the people who live in the core, that are still in the core, that are getting around in the core, they will get back, but the other people in surrounding areas may not gain that trust. And your housing situation is also that. Had we had more mixed scale housing, not just the extremes of either single family houses or high-rise apartments and literally nothing in between, many other cities around the world have everything in the between and very little of the single family or the high-rise, and the impact has been less. So we have two situations of our land use system and our transport system didn't work for other than mass movement and the flushing of in and out during the peaks. And I think your comment, I think, is really important because undoing that is going to be very difficult, but that's the situation we have in front of us.
Yeah, I'm going to want to come back to that, Tim, because it's one of the things that I am worried about is the longer term repercussions. I mean, we've seen such good progress in cities like Seattle who have brought in all kinds of jobs in downtown. Paz was just talking about this from Seattle on Friday. For years now, they're single occupant vehicle numbers have decreased while the number of jobs downtown have increased. Both Portland and Seattle have been really successful in capturing the choice rider in public transit. And I'm worried that the choice rider is the one that'll go away first, and the for how long is going to be the big thing to get back to keeping the momentum toward some of the initiatives you were talking about. But I want to, we have now shifted into the into the group discussion part of this whole thing, and the second hour. I'd love to encourage anybody that's stayed on here with us to go ahead and share your camera if you want and join us in the room here, especially anyone who's going to be talking and asking questions. You're all invited to, I think, Riley, let me know if there's anything we need to do to allow that. Looks like Marjorie was able to turn hers back on. So Washington, D.C. gets the bonus star for the first couple questions. Heather, I've taken you off mute. If you're going to want to go ahead, the scooter topic has been one that I've had in numerous sessions. I'm sure, Tim, that you have too, about sort of some of the, not just age discrepancy of the people who are using it, but when you're showing your slides about the footprint, one of the things I talk about a lot of times, and when I'm out on doing my stump presentations, is there's these boxes that we try to check off as transportation planners. And we look at the footprint and how much of the right of way it's using. And we look at whether it's an equitable form of transportation. And we look at whether it's an environmentally friendly form of transportation. And so here, these scooters come along. And for those of us that are practitioners in space, it's checking off a lot of the boxes that we want to check off. And then you hit the box about safety. And safety can mean both the rider themselves, and we rarely see use of helmets with those, and so we know there's some issues there. More broken wrists there are than broken heads, but and then there's the safety of the other folks sharing that right of way, the sidewalks and the roadways. And coming back to your earlier conversation around how heavily we've subsidized the single occupant vehicle, I think many of us realize that we have to address the safety issue as best we can, but we don't necessarily want to make the scooter operators or the scooter riders 100% the bad guy in this conversation. If they had dedicated safe right-of-way within that, they would be much happier as service providers. So we've got our job to do there. But Heather, anything else that you wanted to add in on your particular question here, if we just unleash Tim on the scooter topic?
This is a great session. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. Sorry, my face is not cooperating. So I would underscore 2 points in particular. One is the reality for local governments of competing policy priorities that they have to weigh. So for example, digital communication to scooter riders and so on and so forth is far easier and significantly cheaper than getting out the word, including through hard copy materials, to those afflicted by scooter riders. And I agree very much, we don't want to create an us versus them situation, but it is important in public engagement to bear that in mind. The other thing in public engagement that's incredibly important, and I have to say I'm a lifelong bicycle rider, and for about 20 years I was a bicycle commuter. The older adult voice, and I work on older adult transportation, is always going to be far more disarticulated than the voices of incredibly efficient, effective bicycle organizations, bicycle advocacy, and more powerful than commercial companies that run the scooters and, from my experience, are very good at getting to know the DC council members in the case of our city. And so I think the other issue is how do you manage these disproportionalities in voice, and how do those affected by scooter riders not walk away feeling that their voice is just not heard at all?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. You know, it comes down to, like you said, the priorities of the local government or the agency that's working with these partners. You know, one of the challenges has been always like effective partnerships. And what we mean by effective partnerships is that it's not just the relationship between the local government or the permitting authority and the transportation provider, but the different community members as well in that discussion. And we really need to rethink how we communicate these new ideas. The challenge that the local governments had was that they were caught flat-footed. They had not built a contiguous and connected bicycle network. They had not had a effective pick up and drop off designated parking space for all of these new mobility services, even though we knew these things were coming, because they couldn't get the changes made to the streets in time. And then these scooters all came in and literally dropped a whole bunch of scooters in the city. And what did they have to use? Because everybody who was using a scooter was new to a device, they felt unsafe, so they'd use sidewalks. Most of the sidewalks in US cities are very narrow, and most of the sidewalks are used by people who absolutely need to use the sidewalk. And so you basically had a built-in conflict from day one. And had we had a system where we had a contiguous bicycle network, the cities would have said from day one, you can only use the bike lane network and you cannot use the sidewalk at all. And here's where you can and cannot move. But we hadn't had that proactive partnership discussion because they were caught by surprise. How they communicated that to the public though, that really was a lesson learned as well. And we've seen some cities in the US do a really good job at it and other cities do a very poor job. And unfortunately, it comes down to the way the agency is set up, the people inside the agency, and to your first point that you made about their priorities. And those things won't change until we get our internal house in order. And that's where a lot of the work has to be done is who do we serve? Who do we work for? Who is our communities? How do we communicate things? Those are the basic things that need to be done up front. And to my surprise to this day, it's very, very uneven across the country.
And Marjorie, I see that you came off mute too and have your camera on. Did you want to jump in on this topic too, or?
I wanted to actually address a different topic. I too am in Washington, D.C., and we actually have a successful metro. I mean, it's safe at night, it's clean, it goes where it's supposed to, and it's been improving over time. No, what I don't hear anybody talking about is how do you redesign the cars on the metro? I don't think it's a question only of touchless things. I mean, there's very little touching in the current metro since you use your card for entrance and exit and you don't touch anything. But you do have to stand in subway cars with people. And the subway cars are designed as cattle cars. So who is thinking about redesigning subway cars?
Yeah, there's a lot of companies right now that are reassessing the layout of the subway cars. Some organizations have basically made them even more open, and some have made them compartmentalized. But the consensus so far is that it's really about wearing masks, and it's really about thermometer checks and checking, and you can't have the 300 people in the subway car again until we have a vaccine, frankly. And so I think that's really the discussion of how frequent are we going to have these services. So imagine a subway car that has a third of the capacity restriction of what it had before. But if you have the same demand, you have to run it 3 times as frequent. That's a resource issue. So these are all of the different discussions that many of the transit associations, these are the large associations that represent a lot of the transit agencies that are having these discussions right now. One of the best examples that we're seeing from best practices is from Taipei in Taiwan and South Korea, Seoul in South Korea. They're almost at the levels of public transit ridership that they were last year, but they're doing 3 things that are very, very specific. Mandatory mask wearing or facial covering. They do thermometer checks, like temperature checks when you enter the space. and they do contact tracing. And I know there's a question here from Xander about contact tracing and data. That's a controversial issue, but if it's because that city and that government sees it as an essential service, they have agreed to do that in terms of a data, from a data privacy issue. They've agreed to do that to ensure that people can still safely move around the city. So, you know, Marjorie, you're raising a really important point, because public transport is designed to get as many people as possible on one ride as possible. And that was the normal last year, but in this new reality, that's not possible to do. So we're going to need to either increase the frequencies or minimize the number of people that go on the service. And what that means is that there are people who are left behind. So how do we get them to get around? London, for example, has the same problem with their tube, and so does Paris with their subway. They've created parallel corridors so that people can use electric bikes or some other type of scooter device to get from A to B. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a alternative to, while they're figuring this out. They've also realized that the rail system is very well designed, but their bus systems weren't. And so they're trying to get more buses put in place, but it comes down to resources as well. Like, we don't have endless resources. So this is a real conundrum that we're in, and we're going to be in this, I think, for the next year for sure.
And Tim, you hit on one of the main points I was going to bring up. And all of this has happened to us so fast, and not just the pandemic hitting us so fast, but now getting into the recovery phases is happening so fast that, you know, I hate to use the consulting story about building an airplane while it's flying sort of thing, but we're doing that. And so the only thing that we have to look towards as a model right now to figure out best practices are some of the countries that were more effective at controlling the virus more quickly than we were, and have been more effective in safely reopening and seeing what they're doing. And we are seeing some examples in Asia in particular, and I think we're going to see completely different kinds of examples, either on public transportation and or the use of the road infrastructure in Europe. And some of these countries that are going to be coming out of it soon. So we're going to have to look at that. And Xander, I'm going to take you off of mute in case you're wanting to dig a little deeper, because I do think that the privacy questions are also critical to this. If we are going to use some of those best practices, we're going to have to go down a different route with contact tracing and personal data and public privacy issues than we've been willing to as a country. And we're certainly going to have to get over this ridiculous, somehow now politicized discussion about the use of masks. But that's slightly different. We're not going to be able to resolve that in this call. But Xander, do you want to dig in a little deeper into your question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'd like to thank Timothy for the presentation. It was super informative, and everyone who's asked questions. Thanks, Adrian. I guess my issue is, like you had started answering my question a little bit, Timothy, was I tend to be a bit of a techno skeptic at times, because I feel like we are quick to take up new forms of technology without fully understanding the repercussions, and then trying to come up with legislation after the fact can prove to be very difficult, as some people are, or some organizations are reaping insane benefits, or like pretty big benefits from that. And I just wonder if, as we're thinking about these solutions, if like lockstep governmental agencies, local, states, and federal, we're also thinking about legislation to sort of check and balance like what's happening on this end. Because as Adrian is saying, everything is going pretty fast, right? Building an airplane while it's in the air. If we think about what happened to Boeing, they're kind of regretting trying to do that, right? To continue the analogy. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, well, so we're seeing this happen in real time. As Adrian said, the plane is being built as we're flying it. But on the data privacy side, we're seeing two very unique things happening right now. Those of you who are in the transportation space or just in the general space know about the privacy issues we have with data with sharing things from our phones, etc. And then there's those of you who know that in the medical world, we have this HIPPA, we call it HIPAA, which are all these data privacy laws about and restrictions about how our medical information gets shared around by health insurance agencies. And they've been very solidly doing that for decades. So there is a parallel now that COVID-19 is hitting our public health area and our transportation area. There's a big discussion on how do we ensure that we keep the public safe while keeping their data secure. And we're seeing little spurts of information coming out from different companies right now. You may have used, you may know at the airport, there is a company called Clear, and Clear does that biometric scan that gets you access to the front of the line for going through the security line. They're kind of like a pre-check service. They're now developing this thing called Health Pass. And Health Pass basically says that you verify that you don't have COVID for X, Y, and Z factors, and then you can go through these lines. They're being asked by many companies, stadiums, public space, etc., to utilize that kind of technology. So we're seeing the private sector already start to think this through, while the government sector is still thinking about how to legislate and protect this. And so the risk we have is that we will get certain things move through government quicker than others, and other things will basically lag behind. And so one of the challenges we have is if a company leads with this and this becomes the norm, like the new Zoom basically, and then government has to catch up, then we're going to see winners and losers and people miss out. But if government can do this together with these companies and figure this out together, then there's a way forward. One thing that's been very interesting is that some governments around the world that we've been working with have already developed their own contact tracing app. So a contact tracing app is basically a way to ensure that everybody knows that everybody else has or doesn't have symptoms of COVID. And they ask you to basically keep your distance, or if you visited a place, they will let you know that, hey, you just visited this place, 4 other people visited this place, and they all tested positive for COVID. We recommend that you go and get a test to make sure that you're okay. So that all sounds good and well, and we can jump to it and say, yeah, it's a smart idea. Many specific vulnerable groups in our population already use contact tracing, especially, for example, with STIs, sexually transmitted infections. There are specific population groups that already do contact tracing with their clinics, and they get notified immediately with their situations. Especially groups that are in, whether they're specific health groups have already got this process in place. The question is, now we're going to be moving into the public space, and the area that I'm concerned about is that this can be cross-tabulated to basically verify who is doing what and where. And that's where we get a lot of big questions. And even in mobility, we have this mobility data specification that we've been using for cities to track how scooters and bikes and stuff are being used. And the ACLU is suing the city of Los Angeles about it because of their question about why we need to have such specific information about people at such specific times. So the conversation is going to keep going. And I think we're going to get to a point where we're willing to trade off certain privacy protections for the safety of the community. And there's certain things that we're not willing to trade off. So I think those are the discussions that we're probably going to have more over this next year. What we will know, though, is that the demand to access public spaces that are high volume locations will be the first places that do this, just to make sure that people are safe.
Yeah. So I'm on a time check here. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that folks were aware. There, as Technology Association put into the chat bar, the economic resiliency one-on-one discussion is starting in just 2 minutes here. And so for anyone who wants to drop off and join that, I know that a lot of the folks that are attending this event are wanting to do that. So we're fine when we see you drop off. Neither Tim or I will take offense at that.
I need to leave as well, Adrian. I need to go. So.
Are you going to need to drop off, Tim? Okay. Okay. Well, I'll stay on for just a few more minutes, see if there's any last questions that come in. I'll put on my Tim hat for a little while. I can fake it. Thank you again very much for joining us today. This was a great conversation, and I owe you a call. We got to talk about some other things when.
Yeah.
But
absolutely. Thank you, everyone, and feel free to reach out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Okay, so I don't know, Riley, if you want to say anything else. Should we? We're down to 6 folks. Were there any other final questions, comments, anything anyone wanted to do before we end the mobility keynote session? Okay, I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat bar, so I think I'll go ahead and wrap it then. Thanks everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Adrian.
Okay, bye.